Ladies and gentlemen, today is September the 21st, 2025, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
What?
Yo,
How are you?
pretty good. How about yourself?
Oh, can't complain.
Well, I've heard that Germans are very good at complaining, so you could always ask one. I think that's a thing that they bear as a badge of honor, is they're very expert at pointing out how certain things are ungood. Germans, would you confirm or deny this claim?
Well, certainly it's had some dramatic results in history.
We had a funny question that I was thinking of. What are the silliest or most lewd sounding city names in the world? So far we have Djibouti and Bangkok. Those are pretty good.
Those will probably be your top contenders,
Yeah.
I suspect. Nothing else is jumping to mind anyway.
For you personally, if you could travel to a country now, expenses paid, where would you go to explore?
I'm not a big traveler, honestly. I prefer reading about other places more than actually going to them.
I see.
I'm not especially outdoorsy, I'm not especially sociable, so traveling for me is mostly just eating and watching TV in a different place than where I usually do.
Fair.
I am unfortunately not especially adventurous.
Say you were, where would you go?
I guess it would depend on what kind of adventure I was looking for. So, what are the parameters then?
Just your, I guess, personal fun factor of seeing a new culture and trying new food. Because I would guess that if you were coaxed or forced to travel for some reason and you got to choose where, you would probably pick somewhere that had good places to eat because we've enjoyed going to restaurants and you're also fairly adventurous with cuisine.
Hmm. Hmm.
Where would you go for
Well,
food plus history? Starting off with a hot seat question here.
well, if it's food plus history, then probably India. India has very good food. I'm sure it has lots of stuff I haven't tried, because I'm sure there's lots of region specific cuisines that I'm not familiar with. And there's lots of history. There's always more to learn about India. I haven't had too much, I guess, Northwest African food. I'm sure they must have some unique cuisine. I'm not even sure what it would be. So that could be interesting. And I don't know a whole lot about the histories of Morocco or Algeria. So that could be a good opportunity as well.
I've heard good things about Morocco from friends of ours in France who got to go there because it's a lot more of a common like summer tourist destination for Europeans, not so much Americans.
Hmm.
Cool, good answer. Valid, accepted. I think Japan is up there for me
Mm.
if I could go somewhere. Yeah, for the same reason of like history plus the food. I really like architecture, like their kind of classic architectural style.
Mm.
Well, we are at day 9 in a subathon that has been going
Oh, yeah.
non-stop.
How's that going?
It is excellent. We have a nice and strong timer. 8 hours and change, so we are guaranteed into tomorrow. Today I casted
Nice.
some games and played some games versus viewers, so different from my usual week-to-week format, but very fun and very interesting. We did a short little rabbit wildlife documentary. There are quite a few rabbits outside of just the house here in the property in South Dakota. And I got a little video of one staying perfectly still to remain invisible. And it's like super visible to a human, but versus certain types of animals, the camouflage of rabbits versus the brush is fairly good. Not super good, but decently good. Especially if they stop moving. Because a lot of predators' visual system works best at tracking motion more so than color detail.
Yeah.
Cats are a good example of that.
Did somebody request you watch that, or did you watch that on your own?
No, I took a video myself. Just a short little video of a rabbit.
Oh, so
staying perfectly still.
Not an actual documentary.
No, I speak in jest and I say a documentary, quotation marks. A short, silly video of approximately 2 minutes in length.
Understood. Well, have you played anything new the past week as a result of the subathon?
Street Fighter 6 I played. That was very cool. I'm working on a duo honor mode run now with Chai, so 2 characters only, not bringing any companions.
Ah.
So we'll see how that goes.
Interesting. Yeah, I think you beat your first run with her.
Yes. The
Nice.
brain was quite good for us. I guess if you don't want spoilers for the last boss in Baldur's Gate, skip 2 minutes ahead. The first round, we had a throw barb that struggled to actually throw to the brain because it was obstructed by vision for some reason. So that caused the brain, I think, to take some bludgeoning damage unintentionally because the object went too far.
Mm-hmm.
So we couldn't do any bludgeoning or slashing in the first round with our main tabs, which are a paladin and a paladin and monk, shadow monk.
Yeah, that'll be a problem.
Yeah.
Well, I'm guessing you were able to sneak in the victory anyway.
Our trick, which I thought of and kind of prepped for just throughout the campaign, was to carry disintegrate scrolls, which were intended to use on Raphael, but we used a different Raphael strategy where we didn't end up breaking the towers. So we just had 3 disintegrates, and that was like 150 damage or something crazy. So we
Nice.
ended up tapping it in. No, I think it was more like 225. I think we got about 75 damage each.
Oh, wow. Pretty good.
Yes. Nice fight. And they lived happily ever after. Baldur's Gate 3, very good video game. Good replayability. I'm enjoying successive playthroughs, not just my first. So you bring different classes and different characters.
Well, is there anything exotic in world affairs you wanted to get to?
I hadn't really heard people buzzing about anything in particular this week. Last week was super spicy in terms of lots of people talking about a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Well, I don't think you missed too much. Probably this is going to be a relatively quiet week by comparison. Yeah, I've got the highlight reel, trade update, pretty minor stuff, and some Ukraine stuff, and then we had a correction and a YouTube question. And that's pretty much it. So we can kind of freewheel if we want to.
Sure. I support this notion.
Well, I guess we can start with Ukraine.
Sure.
Not a whole lot new here, but just some miscellaneous updates. I think last week we talked about how there were some Russian drones that penetrated the airspace of Poland and Romania. And there was some question about whether or not it was deliberate, and if it was deliberate, how NATO should respond. So this past week, there was a new incursion. This time, it was some Russian aircraft penetrating the airspace of, I believe it was Estonia, the most northern and easternmost of the Baltic states. And let's see, what I have in my notes is that they were in Estonian airspace for about 12 minutes. And they were not over, I don't think, any land. I think it was technically over the Gulf of Finland. But they did have to respond. And so this is seen as a new sort of confrontation, a provocation, if you will, from Moscow that needs some kind of response.
Yeah, kind of seems like throwing your weight around, thinking about expanding your sphere of influence and making your power known, but not direct violence, but definitely threatening, like kind of threatening driving boats where you're not supposed to. Similar energy.
Yeah, behavior like this isn't unprecedented, especially in the Cold War. And then over the past 10 years, the Russian government has made a habit of kind of buzzing Western airspace of one kind or another, European airspace or American airspace, in particular over and around Alaska. Generally, they don't actually enter the airspace of the other country that they're trying to agitate. In this case, they did, which is why it's getting more attention. But it's not abnormal for them to have a flight path that makes it look like they're going to enter your airspace, and then you have to respond. So that has been relatively common over the past 10 years. I thought it was interesting that they used MiG-31s for this. Are you familiar with the 31?
No, what is it?
So technically it's supposed to be a fighter, but its exact role is a little more ambiguous than that. It's actually an updated version of the MiG-25. I don't know if you've heard of that either, but basically pretty much the same plane, more or less. And the innovation of the MiG-25 is that it was, I believe it was the world's first Mach 3 fighter. Mind you, it's not unusual for modern aircraft. And when I say modern, I mean like past 50, 60 years, whatever, to be able to go faster than the speed of sound, to fly at supersonic speeds. But it's very rare for them to go at multiples of the speed of sound, like 2 or 3 times. The aerodynamics involved with going at Mach 3 are different than those when you're going at lower speeds. And so it actually requires different engineering. You have to take a totally different approach to designing the aircraft. The United States did something similar back in the 50s, 60s when it designed the SR-71, the Blackbird, which was, I believe, the first Mach 3 aircraft. Mm-hmm. Or maybe I should say the first aircraft with air-breathing engines that could go at sustained Mach 3. There's always some weird specific technicality you have to cover with these things. But it was a Mach 3 reconnaissance aircraft, and it's very famous in the aviation community. Everybody's familiar with it. But the United States, I don't think, ever developed a Mach 3 air fighter or an interceptor, as far as I know. Just the spy plane. So the Russians, by contrast, felt like they needed, well, for one, they needed a counter to the SR-71, but they also wanted something that they could use to kind of show off and intimidate the West and other countries generally. So they developed the MiG-25 to do that. It is nominally an interceptor capable of catching a Blackbird. They didn't really use them all that much. It's not an especially good fighter because, again, it's very specifically designed to fly at very, very high speeds. but that kind of curbs its maneuverability. So there's a limit to the kinds of targets that it's really suited for. So correspondingly, they never really built a whole lot of them or used them that much. And I think most of them ended up getting retired before the end of the Cold War. Again, they did make an updated version, the MiG-31, but I don't think they made very many. I imagine these days it's used more for lobbing cruise missiles and other sort of munitions like that, because there's just not much of an aerial superiority role that it can fill efficiently, that it can do in places like Ukraine or potentially other theaters where it might be used.
Yeah, so it seems like the plane is all about top speed. It's not really like a actual fighter that weaves around and has dogfights.
Yeah, exactly. And it's actually fairly large as well, on account of presumably the engines and the power plant and whatnot.
So it's a plane approaching a rocket ship.
Something like that, yeah. Yeah, I have in my notes here that there were 3 of them, 3 MiG-31s that entered Estonian airspace. Seems a little excessive. I remember reading about the first time the MiG-25 sort of appeared on radar. It was, I think it was sometime in the 70s. I should say not just any radar, but like a NATO-operated radar, or an allied country, if you will, of the United States. This is a time when Egypt was aligned with the Soviet Union, not really allied, but aligned. And they did allow the Soviet military limited access to Egyptian military facilities. And so the Russians, wanting to kind of show off their new airplane, sent a MiG-25 to Egypt. And I think secretly at first, but then they had it take off and then just fly directly across Israeli airspace. And that was the first time anybody among American allies anyway had actually been able to kind of see it on radar. And of course, everybody was quite shocked that the Soviets had that capability. So 1 should be enough. I don't know why 3.
A show of force. Makes sense.
I guess so.
You have one of the spooky new planes, so you're kind of showing that you're top dog in the region. The U.S. doesn't have
really
planes in that. That would be pretty far from where U.S. flies. Where's the closest that the United States flies to that?
To what exactly?
This area in question in Estonia.
Oh, the Baltics?
Yeah.
I think we do have some forces in the area, although it's very limited. You know, NATO in general kind of has a coalition deployment to the Baltics, although it's relatively small. And I think different units cycle in and out over time. But I think U.S. assets are more in Germany rather than in the Baltics.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, also they patrol, you know, the Russian border with Alaska, or the Russian border area with Alaska, if you prefer. Yeah, so the U.S. is not without a presence there. It's just not really a particular priority. Yeah, it's not an especially new plane. I think the MiG-31 was like late 80s, early 90s, something like that. I'll fact check that. I'm curious. Let's see. Oh, earlier than that. Manufactured 1975 to 94. And it was introduced in 1981. Okay, so early 80s. So when was the 25? Okay, so the MiG-25 first flew in 1964. So I was off by a decade.
What's the Russians' newest plane?
Of the ones I know about anyway, I think it would be like the MiG 1.42 something. Although I don't know if that ever actually went into production. Yeah, I don't think it ever did. Yeah, they don't really produce many new aircraft. For the most part, they just update older models, generally old MiGs or old Sukhois. Probably the Su-27 is the main one. Because I remember back in the day, they made, what, the 31, and then the 33 is the naval variant, and then they made 35, 37 as sort of the newest ones. I'm sure chat probably knows more about it than I do. I haven't followed aviation regularly in a while. Oh, yeah. There's also the Su-47, but that never went into production, which is unfortunate because it looks really cool. That's like something you'd expect to see in a video game, but they actually did make at least a prototype.
I like hearing about planes and kind of the meta of people innovating them.
Yeah, the Soviets kind of matched us beat for beat, for the most part. I think, what was it? Are you familiar with the SU... fuck, what was it? The 24? No, it was the 25. Su-25. Yeah, that's the one. The NATO code name for it is Frogfoot. I know the NATO code names for Russian planes. I don't know the actual Russian names. That was not information present in my Jane's guide back in the day, way back in the 90s and aughts, so I never learned those. So the Su-25 is a, what would you call it? Basically a ground support plane. It specializes in providing combat air support and in fulfilling an anti-tank role. So it's roughly similar to the role that the A-10 was originally intended to play. And the Su-25 is notable because it looks suspiciously similar to the design for a plane that, I don't remember the company, but it was an alternative design to the A-10. When the Pentagon and the government want to offer a tender for a new plane, they generally have a competition where companies can provide different designs, right? They can have their design and then compete it against whomever else is trying to get the contract. And the A-10 ultimately won the contract for, combat air support aircraft or whatever it was at the time. But the alternative design ended up, again, disappearing. Basically, people kind of forgot about it. But then the Russians, I suspect, seem to have copied it during the Cold War and turned it into the Su-25. Yeah, I think there was another. Well, no, that wasn't a copy, though. Are you familiar with the Harrier?
It sounds familiar. What is it?
It's that's the jump jet plane, the one that can take off vertically.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's in the process of being replaced by the F-35. So I don't think the public has really seen nearly as many of them. In fact, I'm out of date. They may well have already been retired, and I'll defer to chat on that. But the Russians actually had their own VTOL plane. This is what they're technically called. That's vertical takeoff and landing. And I think the original one, the first one that they made, was all the way back in like the 60s. And that was the Yak-38.
Damn.
I think the NATO code name for that was Forger, I want to say. Don't quite remember. But I don't think they made too many of them, and I think they actually focused on their Navy. Well, I think the Yak-38 was mostly designed to serve on naval vessels rather than for just general deployment. And given that the Soviet Navy was never really quite up to snuff as far as naval aviation, I don't think they really ever got to a point where they deployed them in significant numbers. By the 1980s, the Soviets actually were making a serious effort to build up their Navy to the point where they were in the process of building aircraft carriers. I don't think they ever finished any of them before the Cold War ended, but they were in the process of doing that. And one of the aircraft they designed for their new carriers was a new VTOL plane called the Yak 141 Freestyle. And it was a little more sophisticated. Well, it was a lot more sophisticated than the Yak 38. It was much more of a modern design, at least for that era. But since the Cold War ended, before it could really reach mass production, I don't think they ended up with very many. So VTOL planes, Mach 3 planes, relatively modern, Gen 3 aircraft, like pretty much everything the West had, the Soviets had a version of. Generally with disadvantages, especially in terms of avionics, but overall they almost always had equivalents somewhere. They even had their own AWACS.
What's an AWACS?
I think that, yeah, it's airborne early warning. Yeah, have you ever seen like pictures or video of a big passenger plane looking thing that has a big circle on top of it?
I think so.
Yeah, so that's a radar that's equipped on top of the plane. And so what they'll do is they'll actually just provide information to other aircraft or even the Navy, depending on the theater that they're operating in. And they'll help guide aircraft or, handle traffic, so to speak, as necessary. And as the name implies, they'll also just provide early warning, since the range of the radar is much larger than that of a normal aircraft, like a single-seater or whatnot. So the West, and the United States in particular, has a lot of AWACS. The U.S. Navy has the E-2 Hawkeye, for example, and I think the Air Force operates the E-3 Century. And I think they have a couple unique aircraft, like the E-8. And I think they've got some newer ones in the pipeline I'm not as familiar with. In addition to that, if I remember correctly, the Soviets had the Il-78 Midas. It was an Ilyushin plane. I don't know if you remember, I talked a little bit about Ilyushin when we were doing the Eastern Front thing, when I was kind of talking about the different Soviet design bureaus that handled aircraft production. Mikoyan and Sukhoi technically existed during World War II, and they did design planes for the Red Air Force, but they actually weren't the most important ones. The more important ones were Ilyushin and Likushin, I think. Likushin. Forget the name. Oh, man. Butchering that. Lavochkin. There we go. But then after the war, they kind of faded. They were eclipsed, if you will, within the Soviet government by rival design bureaus. But Ilyushin and Lavochkin continued to exist for a long time, and one of the big aircraft Ilyushin produced during the Cold War was the 78. Anyway, that's quite the tangent.
A little bit about planes. I like it. To me, it's less something that's inherently negative as a direct conflict is. Like, the advancement of your own military tech is pertinent for your own survival. So I can respect making really cool planes and stuff. It doesn't seem like planes fight stuff that often, but to have them is really important just for kind of increasing the bounds of your capabilities.
Well, the fact that they don't do much often anymore is more just the lack of conflict. Yeah. Specifically, the lack of conflict between countries that are capable of equipping and deploying modern aircraft. Conflicts between those kinds of states are relatively rare. The case of Russia and Ukraine, being a good example. We haven't seen a big conflict like that between quasi-relatively modern militaries in some decades. one of the weird aspects of the conflict, really. But they are still important, and there have been earlier examples of relatively modern air forces going at it. I think the Arab-Israeli wars are a good example of that. Six-Day War, 67, and the Yom Kippur War in, I think it was 73. Both of those saw fairly significant aerial components to the fighting, and not insignificant aerial engagements between the air forces involved. Probably more so 73. I think in 67, the Israeli Air Force destroyed the Arab air forces on the ground before they were set to invade. They launched a preemptive strike, in other words. So the Egyptian and Syrian air forces were not really relevant, so to speak, to those conflicts, because they just had no assets available after the preemptive strike. 73 was different. They got the jump on the Israelis for that one, so there was a lot more air-to-air combat then, as I recall. And back then, air-to-air missiles were not quite as dominant, so to speak, as they would be later, so there actually were some gunfights. I think we've talked before about guns on aircraft, haven't we?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, it was the norm. Aerial combat almost always involved, guns up until roughly the 70s, 80s, when 60s, 70s is when they started trying to shift over to air-to-air missiles, but the early going was very rough. Like the early air-to-air missiles were not very reliable. I remember they tried to, they designed the F-4 without a gun. They were so confident in their new missile technology, they thought that aircraft in the future wouldn't need guns. And so they designed the F-4 without one. And when the F-4 actually started seeing combat in Vietnam, they regretted it very quickly because the missiles wouldn't fire, or if they did fire, they would malfunction and they wouldn't hit anything. It turned into a big fiasco. And so very quickly, they started attaching gun pods to the F-4 so that they would actually have a reliable weapon. I think we talked about pods on aircraft last time. You actually can have gun pods that you can attach to them. So that's what they did with the F-4. Yeah, eventually missiles got more reliable, but they learned their lesson from the F-4, and so all aircraft now still carry guns. They have them designed in, so you don't have to use a gun pod. Well, let's see. So we talked about Estonian airspace. There's some unpopular reforms that have been implemented in Ukraine. A couple, I have two specifically here that I read in the relevant article. They kind of have to do with the draft. So Ukraine's army has had an issue with people either deserting or temporarily deserting or switching units. Apparently there's a not insignificant degree of informality in the Ukrainian army, so people sometimes just kind of handshake agreement with other people to switch units. And the army has traditionally just kind of allowed that. So apparently they're going to crack down on that. There's also going to be a crackdown on people abandoning their posts, be it either temporarily or permanently. So I think it's going to be a 12-year prison sentence for deserters and 10 years for quote-unquote insubordination, which is going to be broadly defined in the legislation. And that 10-year sentence is going to apply to switching brigades, switching units, basically. So insubordination encompasses that practice as well. So again, this is a shift in gears here by Kiev. They have not really cracked down on this before, and it had kind of become an accepted norm up until the present. So some people aren't really happy about this. Obviously, something has to be done about desertions and whatnot, but as with many informal norms, people don't appreciate it when they're violated.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been some grumbling in the army on account of this, from what I read. And there's also going to be, and this is kind of in the opposite vein here, they're going to lift the restriction on young men leaving the country. That was one of the rules that they had implemented near the start of the conflict in order to stop young men from fleeing the country and, by extension, evading the country's draft. So they're going to lift that restriction. And from what I read, the government is hoping that this will make the government relatively more popular, because there is some issue there, given how long the war has gone and whatnot. But some people have been complaining because they're concerned that as a result of the lifting of the restriction, more young men are going to leave, and it'll be even harder for the Ukrainian army to meet its recruitment needs. So everybody has something to complain about here. People who don't want to fight can complain about the new desertion rules, and people concerned about people not wanting to fight can complain about the travel rule ending. Yeah, all of this is just kind of part of the government trying to juggle legitimacy with the needs to man the army, which invariably is going to involve conscription to some degree, given the scale of the manpower needs. And then I just had a brief note about occupied Ukraine. This was something I was watching, I think last week. So I just kind of had a short list of some of the things occupation authorities do in occupied Ukraine. One of the interesting things that I heard here is that the occupation authorities really did not entrench themselves that much until after the 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive in, I believe it was Zaporizhia. Before that, the authorities weren't entirely sure that they would be staying, and so they had a relatively light touch approach to dealing with the territories that they were governing. But after the counteroffensive failed, they started cracking down much more. So they've definitely, since 2023, been leaning into the iron fist approach to managing an occupied population. And then I had two specific techniques that they've been using. For one, all phones sold in occupied Ukraine come prepackaged with facial recognition software. That, of course, is mandated by the government, and that just makes it easier for the authorities to track who's using a phone when, so that they can link faces to messages and any other metadata they might be able to get their hands on. Also, they have security trucks that I assume are run by the FSB that just kind of roll around occupied Ukraine and eavesdrop on conversations, which is apparently a thing you can do. And they also try to detect any connection to router traffic. Well, I should say, try to detect any router traffic that is outbound beyond Russian-occupied territories. Kind of reminded me of the surveillance trucks in V for Vendetta. Mm-hmm. If people remember that. That's kind of a dated reference at this point, but it's quite relevant here. A very similar approach to surveilling the population. Yeah, it's kind of weird to me that there is an occupied country in sort of a classical sense. You know, we've had occupations before, like the United States invading and occupying Iraq and whatnot, but having almost a World War II style occupation where near peer states are fighting a conventional war and then occupying some of each other's territory, it still feels weird to see that in the 21st century. Mm-hmm. Well, that's all I had on Ukraine. Like I said, relatively mild week. I did note that there were national strikes in France People are demanding the reversal of recent budget cuts. So that you've probably been seeing, if you've been spending time on social media, lots of protests and whatnot, and footage thereof coming out of France. I don't fancy their prospects, but we'll see. Let's see, I've got a couple miscellaneous trade updates. So China and the US are having talks now. I think they're, I don't remember where they are actually. I was about to say London, but I think that was an earlier iteration. But regardless, these are part of the ongoing talks regarding tariffs and other quote unquote trade related issues. But just before the most recent talk started, Beijing announced that they were going to launch an investigation into NVIDIA, basically an anti-monopoly thing. You know, they say NVIDIA has engaged in uncompetitive practices, and they're going to review the company's practices and whether or not they're going to continue to allow them to compete in China's market. Now, this follows a previous recent order in which they actually, that is to say, Chinese authorities ordered Chinese companies to halt purchases of NVIDIA's AI chips. And this includes the H20 chips that NVIDIA had specifically designed for the Chinese market in order to get around US export restrictions legally. So even the legal stuff that China can buy, the Chinese government doesn't want its companies to purchase. Presumably, they're trying to channel them into Chinese-made alternatives. So this could be just posturing on the part of the Chinese government ahead of the talks, since Chinese ability to produce AI chips is not really quite up to the cutting-edge standard. They could do it, but they're still catching up. And I'm sure Chinese companies would, at least in many cases, prefer more capable modern equipment. Others can make do with whatever. You know, there's going to be big chunks of the market that just kind of take whatever's available, but there's almost always some industries that prefer and maybe even need the most modern stuff in order to stay competitive. So the Chinese government is either posturing here just for the talks in order to generate leverage, or this is a real shift in order to try to boost Chinese AI chip manufacturers and get more demand there, in which case they're going to trade off some growth amongst manufacturers more broadly in exchange for faster development and growth of its AI chip industries. That's the kind of trade-off that the Chinese government has been making a lot over the past 10 years in particular. They've been really leaning into their industrial policy. I think partly that's just kind of a philosophy thing, since the government is more statist under Xi Jinping. And it's probably also partly a reaction to the Trump administration, both the first term and the second term. Since the administration there, the Trump administration has given them reason to think that its supply of chips is not entirely reliable, just on account of the various trade wars and disruptions. So obviously Beijing sees that as a strategic liability and wants to address it, even if it means it has to trade off some growth in jobs in the short to medium term. So two possibilities there. We'll see in a few weeks or months which it is. NVIDIA announced that it's going to invest $5 billion into Intel. I have no idea if government shenanigans are behind this or involved in it, but it seems to be a part of an emerging picture wherein Intel is getting propped up by a combination of private and public sector actors. So if you remember a couple weeks ago, the US government announced that it's actually going to invest in Intel and take shares in it. Now they're going to get even more money in the form of a new investment by NVIDIA, which will see them own, I believe, 4% of the company once the deal goes through, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's going to make them one of the larger investors. And the deal is worth, again, $5 billion, which is a decent chunk of change. Maybe not all that much in the grand scheme of things in the world of chip makers, but $5 billion is still $5 billion. So when you add that with the US government's investment, I think it's adding up to over 10 billion now. So that's liquidity that Intel can use to rejuvenate its business, invest in new equipment, whatever they need to do in order to kind of, well, unfuck themselves, because Intel has not been doing great over the past couple of decades. Some of the more recent efforts to kind of become relevant again have floundered, and there's some question about the company's future. From what I was reading, the plan with NVIDIA involves joint development of PC and data center chips, but it's not going to involve Intel's contract manufacturing business, specifically its foundry business, because there would be some competitiveness issues there, since that part of Intel sells chips to NVIDIA. And so if NVIDIA were to gain control of that, then that would represent, what's it called? Vertical integration. There we go. Which would give them a disproportionate hold on a key supplier, which they could use to gain an unfair advantage over competitors in their core business. So they're going to try to firewall that off while still allowing for joint development of chips. I'm a little dubious about these deals to help Intel. Maybe it'll help, but I suspect the company is just in terminal decline at this point and is eventually just going to get merged, sold off. They're going to have to do something with it. I think the terms of the deal with government make it impossible, technically, for the company to just go completely kaput. But clearly some kind of larger reorganization is in the cards. There's only so much you can do to just pump money into a failing company to keep it afloat. But sooner or later, you're going to need major reforms and maybe just a complete overhaul in order for it to really become competitive again. So maybe this is the first step towards that, but I'm dubious. I'm deeply skeptical, especially given the nature of the government at this point. The Trump administration is known for taking bold moves, but it's also not known for doing an especially good job of thinking through those bold moves. We'll see where it goes. And, oh yeah, the US government has been, Trump specifically actually traveled to the UK for talks with the British government regarding trade. You might have seen some memes and whatnot on Reddit about it, him kind of talking in front of the king and some other officials in his usual style. Not much has come of it on the trade front, which kind of unsurprising to me. There had been a proposed deal after the quote-unquote framework agreement between the US and the UK, in which the UK would see steel tariffs dropped, since the United States government a couple months ago implemented steel and aluminum tariffs on just about everybody. So the British government was really hoping that those tariffs would be dropped. That's not going to happen, regardless of whether it was in the original framework agreement. The recent talks have revealed that the US government has pretty much no intention of reducing or removing those tariffs. The British government did try to kind of spin it. They say that even if the tariffs don't fall, they are getting relatively favorable tariffs, since they're only facing 25% steel and aluminum tariffs and not the 50% that other countries are facing. So some advantage there, but they had really been angling to remove them entirely. Let's see. Yeah, apparently US negotiators were concerned about Tata, which is in the process of shutting down some of its steel production, because a lot of British steel production is not especially cost efficient, let's say. And apparently the problem specifically is not that they're shutting down all of the plants. The issue is more that the capacity that they're maintaining is largely just importing steel, making modifications to it, and then exporting it from there. So they're not really making it entirely in the UK. They're kind of doing what auto manufacturers do, which is to import a lot of the components and then assembling it and then exporting. There's something similar happening with the steel industry in the UK. And the US government doesn't really like that. They see that as kind of skirting the rules. So apparently that was enough for them to just abandon any hope or that the British might have had that they would lower or remove the steel tariffs for British steel. And let's see, that's it for trade. Oh, there was one other trade thing that was sort of related to the UK, but not directly involving the trade talks in the UK. There was a pharmaceutical company called GSK, which announced that it was going to invest billions of dollars into the United States. It's not entirely clear if this is because of the Trump administration. The Trump administration has been intermittently threatening to tariff pharmaceutical exports from the European Union. So that has presented an incentive for pharmaceutical companies to invest in the United States. But like we discussed at the beginning of the second term of the Trump administration, some of these announcements are just designed purely for political consumption. They're never actually going to happen. And in other cases, they're investments that were already planned and that are being repackaged and reframed as quote unquote concessions. So that could easily be what this turns out to be, depending on how things play out. But it is worth mentioning that they announced that they were going to do that, given the sensitivity of pharmaceutical trade, of the pharmaceutical trade at this point. Let's see, I think the only other, well, I had another highlight reel if you want another one of those.
Sure. Get caught up.
Okay, so this is this week's Trump highlight reel. This is the stuff the administration has kind of been in and out of the news for. It's a brief review and it's not meant to be all encompassing. Oh, before I forget, the usual disclaimer, I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in economics and foreign policy. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard, and we enjoy the feedback. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. Kind of go through the VOD. So that said, this week's highlight reel. The administration hit 2 more boats in the Caribbean. That's 3 total now, including the first one from last week. Still not any evidence that the administration has released to the public about just who they're hitting or really even why. So we'll see. They continue to insist that these are quote unquote narco terrorists. Trinidad, I believe, is the gang they specifically cite, which they previously this year had labeled a terrorist organization. Let's see, Trump was in the news for demanding that the Taliban give Bagram Air Base back to the United States. I think this is another one of those shoot from the hip random comments that he just kind of makes offhand without thinking about it. So I don't think this is really a serious thing, but it certainly got people chortling in military communities. I don't know if you remember Bagram Air Base, but it was the largest American air base in Afghanistan during the war. Trump, for whatever reason, has intermittently, over the past 5-some years, basically since the withdrawal, argued that the United States should try to get it back. Generally, he mentions it and then forgets about it for another couple months. So, yeah, I wouldn't read too much into this one. Supposedly, there's been progress on the TikTok front. Congress basically had passed a law that had demanded that it be sold, or if not sold to U.S. investors, then blocked from U.S. markets. And the Trump administration has delayed implementing that repeatedly since he came into power. So there have been on-again, off-again talks with the Chinese government about how to manage it. The GOP in Congress has generally been pretty deferential to the administration about allowing these delays to happen while the talks are ongoing. And supposedly we're pretty close to something final here. They've said that before, though, so make of that what you will. But Trump says that they have a deal in place. ByteDance, the Chinese company that owns TikTok right now, they will retain a seat on the board of directors. But the 6 other seats are going to go to other actors that presumably will be U.S. companies that invest. Also, bizarrely, he recently said that all of the U.S. companies that benefited from the deal would have to pay a fee to the U.S. government for negotiating the deal, and that these fees, quote unquote, could amount to billions of dollars. Lots of conflicts of interest there. But as we've seen, that doesn't seem to matter anymore. The Chinese government is notably quiet about this, so it could be that Trump is talking out of his ass here. But the Chinese government is pretty much almost always quiet about ongoing negotiations like this. So silence doesn't mean it's not happening. We may not know about any final deal until like immediately after it actually finally happens. In inexplicable foreign policy news, the U.S. government declared that Colombia is, quote, failing to cooperate in the war on drugs. Which is kind of hilarious because of countries in South America, Colombia is probably the U.S.'s closest ally. Certainly it cooperates the most in the drug war of almost anybody. So I was extremely skeptical here that the administration was being honest and forthright on this. I suspect the issue is more the government in Colombia right now, which actually is a left-wing government, specifically the president. I believe his name is Petro. Is from a left-wing party. And I think he's also a former guerrilla, even, if I'm not mistaken. So Washington, specifically the Trump administration, doesn't seem to like that. And they've been kind of ragging on him intermittently since Trump came back for the second term. Yeah, I'm not really sure what they want from him at this point, because again, they do cooperate. The Trump administration says that drug production in Colombia has increased under the Petro administration, which I believe is technically true, but I had not thought anybody thought that was because of anything the Petro government was doing as far as going easy on drug traffickers or whatnot. My impression is that that was just an organic development.
Wouldn't it be pretty easy to catch the people who are growing this stuff with satellites?
You mean like coca?
Yeah.
No, it's actually not. A large enough operation could hypothetically be caught with just air surveillance, but it's an ongoing game, right? The people who grow it know that they're being watched, and so they take measures to camouflage the crops to make them difficult to spot from the air. And generally, they grow them in relatively small plots that are not all that noticeable. Assuming they grow them outside at all, it's technically, I believe, possible to grow them indoors, too.
True, yeah. So you could just put them in warehouses.
Yeah. So, you know, the government tries to account for that, and then the traffickers and the growers, they kind of retaliate, and then they just go tit for tat, back and forth. They've been doing that for decades. So it is relatively difficult unless the people the government is going after just kind of get lazy or maybe take on too much risk because they get too greedy. You know, there's different things they can do wrong that get them caught. But in general, if you take it seriously, it's pretty hard to get caught, especially if you've got the money to bribe public officials and whatnot. You know, then you're kind of, then especially you're relatively safe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I kind of suspect the Trump administration is just posturing here for a domestic political audience in the U.S. I don't think they really care all that much. It's kind of like with Venezuela. You know, people have been asking on here and on YouTube about whether or not the Trump administration is going to invade Venezuela or something, but I really don't think so. I think it's just him trying to look tough. That's just something he does. It's the kind of thing that people are used to seeing from developing countries. It's not unusual for leaders in developing countries to kind of pump their chest and talk big about this, that, or the other issue in order to kind of shore up public support. You kind of see that in Turkey. Whenever there's an election there, there's always talk about, invading Greek islands that are disputed. I think we talked a couple weeks ago about a disputed border between, what was it, Colombia and Peru, I think it was, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Colombia and Brazil, maybe. Similar vibe. You know, people act tough in order to kind of look tough just for their followers. But that doesn't mean they have any intention of actually acting out any of the threats they make while they're trying to look tough. People are used to seeing that abroad, not so much in the United States, which is why I think people find it so weird and disconcerting, but it is relatively normal behavior by global standards.
You're just
so I think the Colombia thing
the
is of the same thing. Sorry, what was that?
You're just not used to seeing that from the US.
Mm-hmm.
New table image for us, I suppose.
Let's see, I did have a couple items that I forgot to do last week. And this is on the Trump highlight reel still. This is just stuff that was in my notes that I forgot to add. Let's see, the Trump administration did get a political appointee onto the Fed board. His name is Stefan Moran. And he had been chairman of Trump's Council of Economic Advisors. Well, he actually still is, which is the notable thing. This guy is a key economic advisor for the administration, but he did not resign his position as advisor when he got onto the Fed board. He's going to continue to do both roles. And so that has people talking about him being basically just a proxy for Trump on the board, who isn't actually going to care about the Fed's processes or mandate, and is just going to try to jam through Trump's preferences regardless of normal procedure. So that has kind of raised the specter and the discussion in markets about the independence of the Federal Reserve as a monetary institution. I think we've talked before about how much of a problem it's going to be for everybody, not even just the United States, if the Federal Reserve and monetary policy in the United States become politicized.
Had they ever been before?
The Federal Reserve, no, because the Federal Reserve was specifically designed to be an independent institution. And ever since its creation, it has been so, which is why recent developments with the Trump administration have been so notable. Now, if you want to go back to before the Federal Reserve, then yes, it was extremely politicized. There was a whole last financial crisis back in the 30s, that kind of centered specifically around political corruption, tainting monetary decisions. Yeah, let's see. Lisa Cook, I think there was an update there, but I don't remember if we actually did it last week or not. But basically, courts did rule that the Trump administration cannot remove her from the Fed board. So she may be allowed to return, but I think that's being appealed, so we'll see. Let's see, there's a federal prosecutor named Maureen Comey, whom is related to the former FBI director James Comey, whom you may remember from the first Trump administration. He was famously removed by Trump, supposedly for not cooperating with him on the Russia investigation stuff. So this is apparently his daughter, and supposedly she has been dismissed for political reasons, basically, as retribution against James Comey. So she, of course, is suing the administration, and we'll see where that goes. But there's a relatively long list now of people that the administration is allegedly retaliating against, out of, again, sheer retribution for perceived slights of one kind or another. The Trump administration filed a $15 billion defamation lawsuit against the New York Times. I actually had an update for this. I think it just in the past few days, a court threw that out. I think they technically left open that they could do it again, but they specified that if they do, they have to take it seriously, basically. You know, the way the judge was talking about it, it seems like they just kind of half-assed it and did it so they could get a headline. I thought this was interesting. The Trump administration, I think Trump himself actually said that he was seriously considering removing the requirement for companies to report their earnings on a quarterly basis. He says that every 6 months is sufficient. It would save companies a lot of administrative costs and whatnot that come from having to produce quarterly reports. So I didn't really take this all that seriously. I just kind of wrote this off as another one of his whims. But when I read more about it, I found that there actually is a debate about this in the business community. A lot of people have argued that it would be just easier on them if they didn't have to do, 4 reports a year and instead had to do just 2. Now, of course, the counter argument is that this would mean less accountability on the part of companies to investors and other groups that want to keep track of how companies are doing so that they can judge the veracity of company leadership and strategy. I think one of the countervailing points to that is that having, what would it be called? Semi-annual, I guess. Semi-annual reporting is that it would allow companies to be less short-term in their strategizing. I think that was one of the big arguments in favor of this change. Supposedly, so the argumentation goes, quarterly reporting encourages and incentivizes judging quarterly results, which in turn makes companies think quarterly. In other words, think very, very short-term instead of long-term, which can hurt the long-term prospects for the company. So if you have semi-annual reporting instead, then that incentivizes, in turn, companies to think more long-term and to be less short-sighted. I'm a little inclined to go with the quarterly reporting argument there because I don't really think there's much of anything that's going to stop companies from being short-sighted. That seems like a holy grail of business regulation that will never be found. Mm-hmm. But I recognize that there is a debate there, so that isn't Trump just talking out of his ass again.
Yeah,
so it could be interesting.
Question who benefits from that change.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I did read in The Economist that actually a lot of other developed countries use semi-annual reporting, have that as the requirement instead of quarterly reporting. But in spite of that fact, in spite of only being required to report twice a year, most companies actually report 4 times a year anyway. And apparently that's just because markets and investors prefer that. And so there's a market incentive to do it regardless of regulation. So maybe if they make this change, then nothing actually happens. Okay. I think those were all the major items. Yeah.
How are the Britons doing with their protests and stuff?
I think that was just a one-off. That was not an ongoing protest. That was just a big rally, basically, organized by, I think his name is Tommy Robinson. He's a big far-right figure over there.
Let's see.
Well, I did have a correction. The guy that the Israelis were targeting when they attacked Qatar last week was not actually killed. They did get a few other Hamas targets, but they didn't get their guy. I was not aware, so apologies. And then we had somebody on YouTube elaborate on a question about presidential life insurance. I totally misunderstood the question. I was so confused. Apparently, so the idea here with presidential life insurance is that presidents choose their vice president such that assassination is disincentivized. Basically, the idea is, I'm going to pick a guy who is so much less popular than me and who will be more radical if he becomes leader, that nobody would want to kill me, because if I did die, then they would end up with a much worse leader who would go much harder on people in ways that they don't want. So I don't think that's true. My understanding of vice presidential picks is still that they are picked mostly for strategic reasons. There are specific groups the president wants to appeal to, that he is weak with, and so he appoints somebody who is stronger with them in order to bolster their popularity. I think that is still the main logic there. Even with Trump, J.D. Vance famously is from Ohio, which is a big swing state. So it makes sense to kind of pick somebody from such a state in order to kind of build the ticket there.
What demographics does Vance do well with?
Basically, MAGA demographics, rural conservatives, young college Republicans, I think, favor him. And then, of course, your working class conservative urbanites, relatively speaking, like him. I think most of that group doesn't especially vote Republican, but there has been a shift towards the Republican Party there. So I think he pulls relatively well with that group that has actually defected to the GOP.
Yeah, we talked about Teddy Roosevelt recently and how he was a vice president who became
Yeah.
president because of assassination. It just made me think of Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars, where he's like, strike me down and I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine. It's like,
Yeah.
strike me down and a much worse person will take my seat.
Yeah, that's the gist of the argument anyway. Yeah, I don't think anybody really does that. Because I don't think in general American presidents actually worry about assassination all that much. Obviously, Trump had a close run in, what was it, 2024? But for the most part, I haven't seen anybody really base major strategic decisions on it. I don't think it would really even work all that well, honestly, because a lot of assassins are kind of unhinged. So rational deterrents are not going to deter someone who is acting irrationally. So the game theory kind of breaks down for that reason.
I see.
Speaking of assassinations, the Kirk assassination thing is really turning into another Rorschach test. People are very much seeing what they want to see out of that. It actually reminds me a lot of the Kyle Rittenhouse thing. Do you remember that back in the day?
Was that a gun rights thing?
Kyle Rittenhouse was the kid who went to a protest and then shot two people.
Oh. I don't remember
This
that.
was back during the BLM protests 2020. It was a BLM protest in Michigan, I think. Or was it Illinois? I want to say Michigan. And he went there as part of this libertarian group that was pro-BLM protest, but was opposed to arson, the destruction of private property. And so they wanted to protect private property during the It was a whole confused thing. It's no surprise people misunderstood the details. But he showed up there. The protesters turned on him and then attacked him, and then he ended up shooting two, I believe it was, and killing two. No, did he kill two? He shot two. I think one of them maybe died, but I think the other one lived. Whatever, regardless. He shot two people and then ran off, and it turned into this huge shitstorm online. And basically nobody bothered to read anything about it. Everybody just drew their own conclusions based off of what they wanted the most out of the story. It really was a example of the choose your own adventurism of social media. And to this day, I'm convinced most people don't know the details and just believe whatever the fuck they want about it. I'm getting very similar vibes now out of the Kirk assassination. There seems to be a lot of belligerent, willful ignorance across the political spectrum here. Not all that surprising in the grand scheme of things, just an observation I've made. I was kind of hoping people would kind of, I don't know, get past it, recognize the reality of it and act accordingly, but I guess that bar was too high, because that is not happening.
Yeah, we went through a series of cognitive biases as one of the kind of mindset content pieces from this subathon. And there's a list of cognitive biases you can look up on Wikipedia, and it's a very, very long list of human tendencies to respond similarly in a situation that is partial. It's not an impartial, fair assessment. It's one that's looking for a certain answer more often than not. And confirmation bias is one of those. You seek out information that tells you that you are right at what you believe. That's basically how algorithms work anyway, is they try to get you to stick on the platform for as long as possible, so they'll serve you whatever they have and see whatever you linger on the longest. And people are a lot more likely to look at their side, like owning the other side, than they are to moderate their perspective and like check for the genuine opinions of the other side. Tell me that I'm right. I love it.
Always a lot of demand in the market for that.
Mm-hmm. Chat, you're so right. This evening especially. I haven't read all of it as we've been going, but yeah.
I'm kind of clipping along here. How are we doing on time?
Going for hour 15. As usual, we don't need to do a full 3 hours if it has been a slow week. It's been a very back and forth year. I feel like we've had pretty dead periods where it's just like kayfabe, and then certain hell weeks where you just get all over stacked up. You get the news of 2 months in 1 week, and you're like, well, this is the news week. Previously, it's pretty quiet.
Well, I think part of the reason for that is that some of the extreme ongoing stories have just kind of become normalized.
Mm-hmm.
So, the disruption of the Trump administration is an ongoing story, but it's just kind of so ubiquitous that it's faded into the background.
Mm-hmm.
The war in Ukraine continues apace, and that's as violent as ever, but not a whole lot is changing rapidly anyway on the front line. And so that too is kind of faded into the background. There's other things too, like trade relations and whatnot, but that story seems to whipsaw so much that paying attention to it seems more like a punishment than a benefit. Mm-hmm. You don't really get much for paying close attention when the administration changes tact so much. So the result is that stories that would have been front page news a couple of years ago, certainly 10 years ago, just don't resonate that much like they used to. Even political violence, really. Like, honestly, when the Kirk assassination happened, I had totally forgotten about those Minnesota people, the Minnesota lawmakers who were assassinated. Mm-hmm. Totally slipped my mind. I had to be reminded of it by people arguing on social media. Somebody brought it up, and then it kind of clicked in my head. Oh, yeah, that did happen, didn't it? So, even violence like that is basically becoming more and more normal, I feel. It's just going to be part of the background noise of American society. I did have some random news from South Africa, if you're interested.
What's happening there?
Terrible shit, as usual. South Africa has a pretty negative reputation at this point. It's unfortunate, but doesn't seem to be improving much over time. So basically what happened, and this was a big story in South Africa a couple weeks ago, there were 2 women who came to a farmer looking for food scraps. So he killed them, and then he had his workers dispose of the bodies by feeding them to pigs.
Hey, that's in the movie Snatch.
Pretty much, yeah. So one of the workers told on him, it kind of tipped the police off. They found the evidence, and this guy's court case has been like national news. He himself was punished. I believe he was convicted, but his workers were not, and that led to significant national outrage. There was already a lot of national outrage, because of course the farmer was white, and then the 2 women were black. They were local native. Native is not the right word. They were local black Africans, as they would call them there, mm-hmm. as opposed to white Africans, which is technically what the white people in South Africa are. So the racial element kind of sent people into a tizzy, and the politics has been kind of obsessed with this. And he himself, the guy that actually did the killing, he's convicted, but the workers were not, and people thought that was just very wrong. So I don't think anything is going to come of it per se in terms of like broader ramifications, but it's just another example of how tense things are in South Africa, just almost perpetually at this point. There's been a lot of rumors in the white farmer community that they're being systematically targeted, and that there's an immense amount of violence against white farmers by black Africans in South Africa, to the point where random black people approaching a farm owned by whites can sometimes, by some of the more paranoid ones, be interpreted as a threat, which possibly is what happened here. On the other hand, there's a lot of people, well, basically the majority of the population, indigenous isn't quite the right word either, because the white people are technically indigenous too. The black African population is still resentful, for the most part, of the fact that the white population, even after apartheid ended decades ago, still continues to control like broad swaths of the land in the country, as well as the commanding heights of the economy in South Africa. And so that leads to tension because they're seen as sort of the problem. They're seen as sort of a legacy of colonialism that continues to disadvantage what they would argue is the true native population. And there are radical groups that are growing in popularity that wish to directly resolve that through state intervention in the economy. So this kind of story is not necessarily unusual or necessarily even all that remarkable, because there are a relatively steady drumbeat of these kinds of stories. Not generally murder per se, but stories involving elements of racial tension, like those are quite normal.
What's the percentage population of the demographics there between
As far as like white and black?
Yeah.
I want to say whites are about 10%. I can look it up. Just pop out Wikipedia here. But I want to say that whites are about 10%. I think that it was 20%, maybe even a little bit higher, a little over 100 years ago. And some people were thinking that the white population would actually become the majority if birth rates held, but they did not. Eventually, birth rates of whites in South Africa kind of tailed off, and birth rates amongst the black population became very high. And so the demographics shifted back towards the black African population. Demographics. It's got language and other stuff, but that's not what we're looking for.
Fuzzy Cord says 7.3% from what he looked up.
I'll defer to Fuzzy Cord on that, because I don't know where exactly in the article it is.
I could see how there would still be very high tension, because apartheid was what, in the 80s?
It lasted from the late 40s until 1994.
Okay.
Oh, here it is. Whites, 7.3%. Okay. Coloreds are actually larger, 8.15%. For those of you not familiar with South African nomenclature, coloreds refers to people who are neither white nor black. These are generally people of South Asian descent, but also occasionally people of other backgrounds. I think southeastern South Africa has the largest concentration of quote-unquote colored people. I think Durban is a big center of the South Asian community in South Africa, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, whites are a very small minority, basically. They're not huge by any stretch. But still disproportionately economically powerful.
Yeah. As a carryover from the colonial era.
Yeah.
And it's a mixture of Dutch and British influence, correct?
Yes, mostly Dutch. The Afrikaners were the first to settle South Africa. Well, technically, the Portuguese were the first Europeans there, but I don't think they built a strong set of. I don't think they colonized it per se, like we would think of, like with the United States, for example. They mostly just settled on the coast, and they were kind of transient. But Dutch settlers actually penetrated inland and, kind of set down roots. Yeah, originally they settled like the southwestern coast, but then in the early 1800s, South Africa was transferred, so to speak, to the British. It was never conquered per se, but the Dutch handed it over, I think, as part of one of the peace accords that ended the Napoleonic Wars. Something to that effect, I want to say. So the British ended up with it, and the Dutch on the coast did not like that. They didn't appreciate British rule. And so they actually got onto wagons and then migrated into the interior and set up their own independent states. I believe there were two of them. I want to say one of them was the Transvaal Republic and the other one was the Free Orange State. And so those two, I think they were called the Boer states or something to that effect. So those two Afrikaner states were independent for several decades up until around 1900, I think. And what happened then is that they had found gold. And of course, the British government really wanted that gold. So a war was started, the Boer War, in which the Afrikaner independent states were conquered and subjugated and eventually incorporated into British South Africa. And it was at that point, really, more so than even when it was initially transferred over to Britain. It was in around 1900, after the Boer War, that you really saw more of an influx of the English white people. And I think most of the English white population in South Africa is descended from that particular immigration wave.
What would be the selling points for people wanting to migrate?
Gold rush. Same thing with the California gold rush, Alaska gold rush. Well, I guess it wasn't called the Alaska gold rush. I think it was the Klondike gold rush or something like that. But yeah, similar incentive. A bunch of gold. Everybody wants to speculate, make money fast off of it. So a big influx of population, and then of course, with all the people coming in to mine the gold, the services sector gets a boost because all of those people need services. Supplies, medicine, what have you, all the usual stuff. So there's a market for that, and so it has there's a virtuous cycle that results from a big influx like that. So that drew in a number of immigrants. I think, though, even at their height, the English whites in South Africa were only ever a minority of the white population. So they were never a majority. The Afrikaners were always the clear-cut white majority. I would point out, because I'm remembering this just now, the Afrikaners were not exclusively Dutch in origin. They were mostly Dutch in origin, but I think there was also some other groups that migrated in around the same time. I think French Huguenot was one of them, one of the major contributing groups to the Afrikaner ethnicity, so to speak. Have you ever heard of them?
No, Huguenots?
Yeah, so Huguenots were basically French Protestants. And for a while, they were a large minority in France, and then they were basically systematically targeted and either expelled or killed in the 1700s, I think it was. So they're not really a big group in France today, but way back in the early modern period of France's history, they were a notably large group. And when they were expelled, there was, of course, a big emigration wave out of France of people who were in this group. And some went to, the United States, or what is now the United States was at that time the English colonies in North America. Others went to, more far-flung places in the Caribbean, maybe even South America. But a chunk of them ended up in South Africa. And so they were, again, not the majority contributing ethnic group. That was the Dutch, but French Huguenots definitely had an influence. think there's a famous painting. So one of the things that came out of the French Wars of Religion in the late 1500s is that as part of the peace agreement, basically, that resolved the conflict, Protestants in France were given kind of autonomous control over their territory. You know, they weren't everywhere, but in the areas they were given sort of communes or special legal status that kind of made them de facto semi-independent from the state. France still had kind of a feudal arrangement to its government structure at that time, so that wasn't necessarily all that unusual. But it was unusual to give it to such a distinct religious group, especially one that was so antagonistic with the Catholic Church. And one of their strongholds was, I believe, the port city of Cherbourg, if I'm remembering this. I'm probably not. There was one port city in Western France that was a particular Protestant stronghold. And in the 1700s, again, I think this is early 1700s, when the French state decided to crack down on these pseudo-independent Protestant enclaves, they actually laid siege to this port city, and there was a famous painting of it. I think it actually had Cardinal Richelieu in it, in which he's kind of walking around the barricades outside of the city.
La Rochelle.
There you go. That's it. I totally forgot it. Siege of La Rochelle. Yeah, here's the Wikipedia article for it. I'm not generally a guy for paintings, but something about that painting always stuck with me. I'll send it to you.
Thank you. Damn, this looks good. I'll show it on stream. The Siege of La Rochelle. Okay. Henry Motte. This is really well done. The red that he's wearing really pops.
Yeah, he was a cardinal. I got the year wrong. It was early 1600s. So that would have actually been during the 30 Years' War. Okay. I was way off.
Ships in the background here, and then little boats with oars. This is heckin' amazing. So who's sieging who here?
So this is the French crown besieging the city of La Rochelle. I can't pronounce it. You'd think after 4 years of French, I would have learned it, but no, it didn't stick. Yeah, this is the French crown besieging the city of La Rochelle. And again, La Rochelle was a Protestant stronghold, and they were trying to strip Protestant enclaves of their pseudo-independent status in order to bring them under the direct rule of the French crown.
Gotcha. So this dude is probably Catholic, and these monks are probably Catholic or priests, whatever.
Yeah, they're probably friars or what have you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, I believe, Cardinal Richelieu.
Gotcha. Cardinal, very high ranking.
Are you familiar with Richelieu?
No.
So he was the Eminence Grace of Eminence Grace. I'm probably mispronouncing that too. He was a leading political figure in France in this time, late 1500s, early 1600s. He was not known for being like a contender for the throne or something like that. He was known more for being a very savvy administrator. Like whatever you needed done, he was the guy who could do it. And he was considered so competent that he actually survived multiple administrations, multiple changes in leadership in France. Yeah, he's kind of seen as like a master manipulator, somebody who operates behind the scenes in order to kind of get what he wants. But he never himself made a play for power. His power was purely bureaucratic. But that itself gave him a lot of influence over the state.
Seems like a go-getter. So if he's getting stuff done, then, well, he has his own plans too. So interesting. He's wielding a sword.
Got to get those Protestants.
Yeah. Yeah, I think things have mostly settled down between Protestants and Catholics these days. Not as many sieges of cities.
Not so much. Not in a while, anyway. Let's see. I'll send you a map of French Huguenot territories in France. Just kind of saw that while I was looking through the article here. So those were all areas where French Protestants were prominent.
Okay. I'll show this. So the purple are the areas where the Protestants are?
Yeah, and the darker the color, the more there were.
Normandy. Occitan. Okay, so south of France. It's interesting because my family lived in the south of France for a little bit, and it was in one of these Christian areas, and they went to a Christian church there, or a Protestant one. Yeah. This was 1520 to 1685. The information on the map is in French. That's cool. I think it was Germany where the Protestant Reformation began. Martin Luther was the guy.
Yes, I believe so. There had been some people in other places that had kind of criticized the Catholic Church, but nothing that really took. But Martin Luther and his movement were the first ones that kind of really evolved. That gained traction and evolved into something that could actually be opposition to the Catholic Church, basically became Protestantism, such as we would know it. Although it's interesting to note, Martin Luther himself didn't actually want a revolution against the Catholic Church. He just wanted to criticize it and for it to reform. He was actually quite taken aback by the scale of the violence that erupted subsequently between Protestants and Catholics.
Yeah, there's a subsect of Protestantism called being Lutheran, and that has a lot of, I think, stylistic carryovers where it's more similar to Catholicism than Protestantism. So he wasn't inherently hostile to the whole process of Catholicism. There's most of it he probably liked a lot. It was the issues with how it was being run that he was wanting to critique.
Yeah.
But there is still a bit of a, I would say, casual rivalry now between Catholics and Protestants. Like, normally they have their ways of talking shit about the other side. I think Catholics, maybe on average, are more self-deprecating than Protestants.
Well, Protestantism has always been very austere. The religion is kind of structured in a way that forces you to be a little more self-serious. So that doesn't surprise me. Yeah, it started in Germany, but I think it actually gained prominence in a couple other places. I think originally Bohemia, basically what is now the Czech Republic, that originally was a major center of Protestant religion. And I think there was a significant minority in Hungary as well. The Hungarian king of that time was relatively tolerant and welcomed people of diverse views and whatnot. So there was some Protestant thinkers who went there and came from there as well. Yeah, I think pretty much the entirety of the Protestant population of Bohemia ended up getting wiped out over the course of the 30 Years' War. So now it's very, very Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a time when it was otherwise.
Yeah, people historically have treated heretics or perceived heretics very violently.
Yeah, yeah. The Catholic powers at the time went pretty hard, especially over the course of the 30 Years' War. 30 Years' War remains one of the most violent conflicts in the history of Europe. And if you look at it from if you measure the destructiveness of the conflict in terms of the proportion of the populations affected that died, it actually ranks up there with World War II in terms of how destructive it was.
Wow, I didn't know it was that bad. Crazy.
Yeah, there was, I think, a survey in the immediate aftermath of World War II in Germany asking people if this had been the worst conflict in the history of Germany. And there was actually a very large number, a large proportion that said the 30 Years' War had been worse. Mind you, these are people who had directly and just experienced World War II. And even then, they still thought the 30 Years' War was worse. Didn't mean that they thought World War II wasn't bad. Obviously, they did. Just 30 Years' War proportionally probably killed as many, if not a larger portion of Germany's population. Yeah, we'll probably never know exactly how many people were killed, but I think it was something like a quarter or so of the population was wiped out over the course of the 30 Years' War, and potentially higher. I've heard estimates as high as like 30 or 40%.
You know, it's kind of similar to how the Civil War treated the U.S. If you're attacking your own, then your casualties are way higher than if you're attacking someone else.
Yeah, that's a good summary of it. But also just the economy was not as sophisticated at that time. In other words, they didn't have complex supply chains that had lots of redundancy. So if you devastated the agricultural base of a given region, which is generally what happened when armies went through, since armies needed lots of food and supplies. So they would buy up a lot of the food in a place, and if they were in hostile territory, instead of buying it, they would just steal it. And whatever they didn't steal, they would often burn to deny it to the rivals that they were fighting. So the result is that there were a number of famines at this time. And that's part of the reason it was so destructive. But then, of course, also a number of important cities and trade centers were laid siege. And as was normal at the time, part of the way you paid your troops was with the loot that they stole from cities they successfully conquered, which generally involved not only looting, but also raping and killing the local population in the city that they took, which obviously also increased the violence and destruction of the conflict. So rinse and repeat that process all over Germany, as well as a good chunk of the rest of Europe, over the course of 30 years, yeah, you're going to kill some people. It'll be nasty. Yeah, I think the Chinese even have a name for that. I think it's, I don't remember what the actual word is, but it translates as soldier disaster. And it refers to the impact that armies have when they pass through a territory. Because again, they're soaking up huge amounts of resources, which then can deny them to the locals. And if they engage in scorched earth, then it's especially bad. And conflicts in China could be so large and last for so long that they actually just developed a name for the corresponding disasters that would befall areas after armies went through them.
Yeah, they definitely kind of scavenge what they have available. I'm kind of wondering what the processes were that, I guess, brought us in the direction of certain codes of conduct where militaries are not supposed to do stuff like that.
Oh, stuff specifically conflicts like this. they got progressively worse over time as Europe's population grew and as its economy developed. You know, more and more. Part of the reason the 30 Years' War was as bad as it was is specifically because of the commercial revolution that had started around 1000, depending on when you want to date it, or maybe around the Age of Discovery when that started in sort of the 1400s, 1500s. But regardless, there was a lot more money in Europe, not just in terms of like overall economic activity, but actual cash. And the result of that is that there was a lot more money to be spent on mercenaries. Before, if you were raising an army, you were probably raising an army of guys who were basically you had given land to in exchange for loyalty. That was sort of the feudal setup. You have your nobles, they govern their own land that you gave them, and in exchange, when you call on them, they have to provide some soldiers to go fight for you. That had been the bulk of a lot of armies in the medieval era. But in the early modern period, because of economic development and the evolution and emergence of lots of liquidity in the global economy, suddenly it became feasible to not rely on that source of manpower and to rely instead on just mercenaries. You could raise whole mercenary armies and field them against, these sort of old-fashioned feudal armies, and the mercenaries could win. It was a total viable approach. There was actually a famous leader in the 30 Years' War. I think his name was Waterstein, something like that. He got famous and powerful specifically because he was one of the first guys to develop this model. He was a kind of warlord who worked for the Catholic powers. And, they tried to field armies of, feudal lords and whatnot, combined with mercenaries. But this guy figured out how to kind of turn it into a business model where he would raise money, basically start up capital, and then he would hire up mercenaries. Then he would go and attack the enemy, conquer a territory, loot the shit out of it, and he would use the money from that to continue paying the mercenary army, such that it would be self-sustaining. It sounds very simple, but he made it work much more effectively than anybody else had, at least in recent memory at the time. And so correspondingly, this guy who did not really come from a noble background was able to elevate his position, his station in Europe, much higher than would have been possible otherwise. Unfortunately, the downside of that is that, again, the conflict was much worse than it would have been otherwise, because by using this model, you increase the number of armies operating and in turn increase the burden on the civilian population. Was it Wallenstein? It was, okay. Albrecht von Wallenstein.
How's Southeast Asia doing?
Southeast Asia? Mm-hmm. Oh, I forgot about the H-1B thing. Totally slipped my... Have you heard about this?
No. What's this?
Okay, so this was announced, I think, 2 days ago. The Trump administration just suddenly announced that the fee it charges for applicants to H-1B visas will be set at $100,000. Mind you, it had been like 1,000. So this is a huge barrier to any company that wants to hire foreign workers. So the debate right now is whether or not this is actually going to stick. And the administration has kind of sort of started walking this back, because they had been saying that this is going to be a fee that has to be paid every year and for every application. Even if the application ends up failing, you would still have had to pay it. Now they're saying it's not something that has to be done every year or even necessarily for every application. And they've also said that existing H-1Bs are exempt from this requirement. So this will only hypothetically apply to new H-1B applications. But I don't even think it's especially legal, because I think the relevant statute says that the fees have to be set just to cover costs. And very obviously a hike from, around $1,000 to $100,000 is not being done because costs have increased that much. The administration is very clearly here trying to discourage companies from hiring foreign labor. So I suspect that they're going to get sued over this, and the court is going to end up throwing it out, most likely. But for now, even in the short term, it's going to have a disruptive effect. It's going to have a chilling effect on companies that would like to hire H-1Bs. I think they announced along with the announcement that they were going to do this, they also said that they recommended that workers on H-1B visas who are outside the United States needed to return to the United States before 24 hours after the initial announcement, when nominally the new rule would go into effect. And I think the implication was that if they did not do so, then when they tried to re-enter the US, they might have to actually pay the new fee. So the result is that there's been a huge scramble of H-1B holders who are not currently in the United States to get back in. And there were even, I think there was one report about some Indian guys that were on a plane out of the US when they got the news and begged to be let off the plane so that they could stay in the US because they were afraid they might not be able to get back in. Anyway, you mentioned Southeast Asia. I thought of that. Singapore is going to benefit big time if they actually do keep this H-1B rule in place. Because what's not going to happen is that tech companies are going to hire more American workers. It'll just be much, much easier to send more work overseas. And Singapore is kind of an emerging tech center in Southeast Asia. They benefited greatly from the big crackdown on Hong Kong by the Chinese government back in 2019. There were a number of businesses that got out and just preferred Singapore instead. And it, of course, has its own tech scene that's kind of been emerging for a while anyway. And then with the trade war that Trump launched in his first term, there were some tech companies that hedged their bets by setting up some facilities in Singapore as a potential alternative if things really kicked off between the United States and China, at least as far as trade conflict goes. So now, if it is going to stick, if this rule does stay in place, probably Singapore will be the recipient of a significant influx of new business. So Singapore is sitting pretty, has been for a while, so maybe no surprise. Thailand still dealing with its political bullshit. They've got the new government in place, but it's unstable, and assuming the party in charge right now honors its agreement, there's going to be new elections in a few months. So we'll probably see more drama shortly. Really haven't heard anything out of Malaysia recently. I assume their reform government is still in power. I don't think they were ever kicked out, if memory serves. But I also don't know how much progress they've really made. Vietnam and Laos are just kind of there. Vietnam is still dealing with all of the trade disruption from the Trump administration and the trade deal, quote unquote, that was implemented. Vietnam is kind of in an awkward spot because on the one hand, they don't trust China, but they don't really trust the United States government either. So they're kind of trying to balance them off of each other. But both of them are a little mercurial in terms of how they approach foreign policy. So it's a little difficult for small countries like Vietnam to do that at times. Cambodia is still pretty firmly in the Chinese camp, but I think for the most part, the government is just going full crony capitalism and just kind of leaning into organized criminal elements from mainland China. There's lots of casinos and other sorts of touristy things that organized criminal groups are setting up in Cambodia in order to benefit from Chinese tourism and immigration and whatnot. So the government seems to be leaning into that as far as generating growth and as well as just revenue for the government. They don't seem to particularly care about diversifying much, probably because it's extremely corrupt and most of the money ends up in the patronage network of the president. That would be my guess anyway. So the result is that China has a pretty firm ally at this point in the form of Cambodia. I think we talked about Indonesia already. They were the ones having the big protests a few weeks ago.
Yes.
Burma's civil war is ongoing, but I haven't read any updates about it. So I'm not sure if anything has been really changing there. Last I checked, the rebels were making gains, but mostly along the periphery of the country. They still haven't really penetrated into the interior, where most of the population lives, and in turn, where most of the, where the government is strongest, basically. think that's pretty much everybody.
Cool.
I guess East Timor. Does anybody really care about East Timor?
East Timorans.
Well, yeah, fair point. There's not that many of them, though. Are you familiar with East Timor?
Not really.
Oh, well, you may find this of interest then. It was an outpost of the Portuguese Empire originally. They colonized it. It was one of their first outposts in the initial expansion of their empire in the 1500s. After their empire declined and they lost most of their territories, East Timor was one of the few that they held on to. It's a relatively short list, but East Timor was on it. And I would point out here that it's not an entire island. There's an island called Timor, and the Portuguese got the eastern half of it, if I remember correctly. That's hence the name East Timor. They were just hanging on to part of the island. And not much of substance happened there. Obviously, they proselytized, and as a result, East Timor is almost entirely Catholic now. And it's one of the few parts of the Indonesian archipelago that is 90% Catholic. Christians are not unusual in Indonesia, but generally they're maybe 40% of the population of a given territory at most. So East Timor is kind of an outlier in that regard.
I'm pulling up
Timor.
I'm pulling up the map real quick just so people can see it. It's north of Australia, kind of south of Indonesia. Papua New Guinea is to the east. So not too far from Darwin in Australia. Timor-Leste. I guess that's a French carryover.
No, I think it's local.
Oh.
Don't know off the top of my head. Let's see. Yeah, I'd have to look it up. Anyway, it was part of the Portuguese Empire until I want to say the 1970s. And what happened is that it was supposed to be nominally independent, but after the Portuguese left, the Indonesian government moved in because the Indonesian government argued and had argued since its independence that East Timor belonged to them and that it should be annexed into Indonesia. So when the Portuguese got out, the Indonesians actually invaded and conquered it. And the US government didn't really give a shit because Indonesia at that time was a steadfast American ally in the Cold War. So Washington kind of gave them a pass on that. But the local population did not appreciate it. It ended up becoming sort of the focus of exploitation by the Indonesian government as well as politically connected interest groups. And when the locals started to push back, there was a violent crackdown. And so the result was a couple decades of political violence targeting the people of East Timor, as well as intermittent acts of violent resistance by that population against the Indonesian government. Now, in that time, which extended past the end of the Cold War, I would point out, through the end of the 70s, 80s, and then into the 90s, this conflict kind of continued and dragged out. Most people didn't pay much attention to it. But there was a peace process that I want to say started up in sometime in the 1980s, in which the resistance groups and the Indonesian government were brought together, and they tried to negotiate an arrangement. Now, the resistance groups wanted East Timor to be independent, like it had originally intended to be. The Indonesian government, of course, found that to be anathema. They believed that would violate the territorial integrity of Indonesia, which any government would be very sensitive about. But eventually, enough pressure was brought to bear by a combination of the international community, as well as domestic political considerations in Indonesia. Mind you, this mid-late 90s period is when the Suharto government, which is the military junta that had been governing Indonesia, finally fell. And so in the wake of that, with the democratization of Indonesia, there was less resistance to giving East Timor away. So the stars kind of aligned for East Timor, and an agreement was reached in which Indonesia actually would withdraw from East Timor and allow it to be an independent country again. And this is what happened in the year 2000, I believe. East Timor officially became independent again in the year 2000. And at that point, the conflict finally stopped, and people were able to enjoy some peace for a while, although not stability. Supposedly, excuse me, supposedly, the Indonesian government still supports elements within East Timor that are restive, shall we say, that kind of fight against the government, supposedly to protect Indonesian interests in East Timor. But other people say it's just normal political instability in a country that doesn't have a large economy or stable democratic political institutions. Make of that what you will, but regardless, it's not really been in an entirely peaceful place since independence, but they do not at least have a larger power consistently predating on the local population anymore. So some progress, but still some ways to go. It's just been very quiet ever since. You very rarely hear about it. Oh, I forgot about Brunei. That's another one. The Brunei Sultanate is a tiny country on the coast of Borneo. It's a major oil producer, actually. When I say major oil producer, I don't mean that it's a major supplier of oil on international markets, but the government gets all of its money from oil exports. So the overall amount is not that much, but the government is, well, the population, as well as maybe just the size of the country, is small enough that that little bit of oil money goes a long way. So it's actually a fairly wealthy territory. It's like a little miniature Gulf oil sheikdom, kind of out in Southeast Asia.
Huh.
It's a funky place.
What do they do with their wealth per population?
Sorry, what?
What do they do with their wealth per population?
Nothing spectacular. I think they have kind of a normal Gulf oil monarchy arrangement where the government just kind of pays people not to revolt. So everybody's kind of content with things. I think there's been some infrastructure investment. It's technically still an absolute monarchy. They don't have like modern democratic governance. The Sultan still pretty much runs it as his personal fiefdom. But like any smart monarch would do, he spends a chunk of that on, public goods and whatnot, to stay in the good graces of the population. If I remember correctly, the Sultan of Brunei has a weird lineage. Because originally it had been, I think, local Polynesian or Melanesian, whatever, a local dynasty governed the Sultanate of Brunei. And then in the early 1800s, it was ruled by a sultan who didn't have any children. But he ended up befriending this English guy. I think he was like a merchant or something. And so he got to be good enough friends with him that he actually wrote him into his will. So when the Sultan died, this just random English merchant guy inherited the throne and became the new Sultan.
Wow.
Yeah, apparently he had quite the field day. I think there's rumors that he spent a whole bunch of time in the harem when he first inherited the country.
The fuck?
Yeah, English society doesn't really have an equivalent to harems, so can't entirely blame him. But regardless, the current Sultan of Brunei, I believe, is actually descended from that guy. It is technically an English dynasty. But of course, they've long since assimilated into the local culture, so they speak the language and whatnot.
I was gonna ask if, didn't the previous Sultan have a wife or something? And then it's like, well, there's a harem section, then that kind of tells you what he was staying busy with.
Yeah, with no children, the wife is kind of old news. He may not have had a wife, though. I'm not sure. I don't remember the details of it. Oh, the Philippines. Yeah, that's in Southeast Asia, too, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think they've been having protests recently, sort of generic anti-corruption protests, from what I was reading. I don't think they're as large as the ones that we've been talking about in Indonesia, for example.
Mm.
But I think that was the big news item out of the Philippines recently. Yeah, I don't think there's too much else going on with the Philippines. The last thing I remember was the big blow up between Sarah Duterte and the president. What was his name? Marcos. Yeah, I still can't believe her father was actually handed over to the ICJ. That's wild to me.
Remind what the
Nobody
ICJ
ever
is.
does that. International Court of Justice. I believe that's what it's called. Basically, the Europeans have their own little court of justice that has international jurisdiction. So if you violate human rights somewhere, they have the power to convict you, even if you're not European or the thing you didn't happen in Europe. So of course, lots of people bring cases against dictators in the developing world, but nothing ever happens because, of course, they're not just going to turn themselves over to a European criminal court. But in the case of the Philippines, there was the falling out between the Dutertes and the Marcos family. And so the Marcos family actually apprehended the former president, Duterte, and just gave him to the International Court. And he's being tried as we speak. It's pretty wild shit to me. I've never seen anything quite like that.
Is that like Interpol? What's the criminal court that administers justice like that?
It's not, they don't have an administrative arm, so to speak. It is purely judicial.
Oh.
They have no enforcement mechanism. It's not like recognized or codified in international law. It is, as I understand it, a purely European initiative, something they did on their own. They just kind of gave it universal jurisdiction. As you can imagine, a lot of other countries are not entirely happy with that. They see it as a kind of legacy form of European imperialism, where they're trying to kind of police other countries. But then, of course, the counter argument is that, if they don't want trouble with it, stop breaking the law. Like they keep violating human rights and all manner of other things like that. So there's always a non-zero part of the population overseas that, while not entirely happy with Europeans continuing to meddle in their affairs, also doesn't mind it if they want to hold corrupt assholes accountable now and again. So there is kind of a tension there between those two instincts in overseas politics. But they do not have an administrative arm. They depend purely on people either voluntarily handing themselves over or host governments handing them over. But they cannot impose their will, so to speak. They can't go and arrest people. And European governments really don't go overseas and arrest people either. They don't even really pressure other governments that much to hand over people. Technically, it did happen with Serbia and Milosevic, but in that case, Serbia was trying to improve relations with Europe in the wake of the Milosevic government, and so that gave the Europeans more leverage that they could use, which they then did. But that's not something they generally do with like Africa or Latin America or what have you. In those cases, compliance is almost entirely voluntary, with nothing more than token pressure applied to ensure otherwise.
You have been found guilty of crimes. Would you like to go to jail?
Yeah, that's kind of it, really. No joke. As you can imagine, relatively few people have been convicted in the court, unsurprisingly. But people still persist in continuing it because they think it's useful to have that as a kind of sword of Damocles with which to threaten would-be ne'er-do-wells, so to speak, in other countries. It's not without some impact, because keep in mind, even if you're a bloodthirsty dictator in a developing country, you may spend most of your time in your own country, but you do occasionally like to splurge. You do like to travel to someplace nice, so you can take your family, or probably more like your mistress, someplace nice and show off, maybe buy some luxury goods that you can only get in some of the wealthiest parts of the world, that kind of stuff. And, there are places other than Europe where you can do that, but Europe is a very popular locale. And if the court comes after you, it's entirely possible that you could de facto be locked out of Europe. And again, that's workable, but a lot of leaders would prefer to continue to have that access, if only for purely superficial bullshit reasons.
I do think we have a couple questions.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Scroll. There it is. Okay. Commenting on the. I need to write that down actually, because I totally forgot to add that to the notes today. So I'm just going to do that real quick. Highlight reel. There we go. 100K fee. Okay. Commenting on the H-1B situation, the fee is for new hires, not for existing hires. The issue is they made the announcement and they said anyone outside the U.S. on travel had to be back in the U.S. within 4 calendar days. Okay. I'll defer to chat on that. Yeah, certainly the initial announcement was lacking in detail. It was quite the panic in the immediate aftermath. Let's see. If you could take a piece of technology from a museum today and travel with it back in time, what would you bring and to which era? I mean, all the coolest tech almost invariably is some kind of electronic thing that requires electricity. And without electricity to make it work, I don't know. Maybe you could take a power generator. But then what would you have to power it? I mean, what would you power with it if you didn't have any modern stuff? Mm. Yeah, I don't know that there's anything I would take. Well, it's from a museum today, specifically in the question. A piece of technology from a museum today and travel back in time. I don't know. I mean, I think some of these alternate history fantasies, there's whole YouTube channels that just do nothing but alternate history. But one of the flaws in the whole what technology could you introduce early thing is that in a lot of cases, technology actually was developed in the ancient era, a lot of what we would consider modern technology. Not like computer chips and stuff, but things like the steam engine or rails, modern forms of steel. Like some of that can be dated back thousands of years. But the reason it didn't take off was not just, was therefore not that people couldn't develop it. The issue was that it wasn't really economical to develop it. Like they could make a prototype, but there just wasn't demand for that kind of technology. It was often cheaper just to use slaves, for example, than capital-intensive equipment. I think the Greeks made a steam engine, but like, why do you need a steam engine when you've got a bunch of helots in the field who you can kind of whip to do what you want? It's a little bit redundant in that sense. So, you can bring back technology if you want, but it may not have all that big an impact, less than you might think. You would need not only technology, but a whole apparatus of state in order to kind of govern in a relatively modern way, such that you could have something like a modern economy, modern financial institutions, a pipeline of engineers, all that kind of stuff is sort of the foundation that allows modern technology to flourish. But if you take that away, then a lot of modern technology is just trinkets that can't really be used effectively. So I don't know how much impact I could really have doing this. Bringing back some technology to try to jumpstart the Industrial Revolution or what have you. I don't know. Are there cyanide pills in museums? Because if I have to go back and live in the medieval era or caveman times, I think I'd rather just skip it. I would not last long anyway. It might be just easier to take the pills at that point.
I'll pass on that. Yeah, the past gets romanticized a lot. But basically, every era before this one is less comfortable, decidedly, in many categories. The question of when and where decides what those categories are, but this is a very cushy time to be alive. Just per capita violence is at an all-time low. It used to be way higher. There was the kind of bias of the fact that the state of nature used to be a Garden of Eden. We used to just kind of be in harmony with nature and each other and just connected to the earth before all this political stuff, when really the odds of you getting shot with arrows or stabbed were way, way higher in that state because resources were more scarce and quality of life was lower, so you're willing to take those grave risks of murdering someone. Whereas nowadays, you stand to lose a lot more if your quality of life is higher. So why would you risk a great crime when you have all these other amenities afforded to you?
Yeah, I think I'm best suited to the present. Not a lot of enchiladas in medieval Europe.
That's true.
Actually, I just had some fried calamari yesterday.
Oh.
Went out for a relative's birthday. Don't think they would have had that in medieval Europe either.
No, probably not, but it's in Baldur's Gate.
Is it?
Yeah, just kill a mind flayer with a fire spell.
Touche.
Thank you.
Oh, that's all we had for questions. Did you have anything you wanted to get to?
Not in particular, I don't think. I did hear some kind of local gossip from the South Dakotans. There was a gathering of people who came over to our property and we had barbecue and stuff and fellowship, and people were talking about things. And apparently, I learned that Minnesotans have a lot of Swedes and a lot of Finns. And there's a bit of drama and rivalry between the Swedes and the Finns in that area. But those would have been people who migrated over from Scandinavia. But Finns are a different lineage than Swedes are. They're not Viking people. They're from the, Ural Mountains is the region?
Yeah, sort of the Volga basin, basically.
Yeah, but that's something that might end up being in American Nations later on. I haven't finished the book yet. But
you're like me. You take breaks from your books.
Yeah, sometimes I'll switch before I finish one, and then I'll go back to it later.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm afflicted with that. My case is probably worse. I have books that I started years ago that I still haven't gotten back to yet. Should I remember first year or two of this segment, we were talking about Chinese culture, and somebody recommended a book called Sources of Chinese Tradition. It was actually a 2-volume book. And I actually did buy it in order to read it. So I have started that. I just haven't gotten back to it in about 7 or 8 years. It's still sitting on my nightstand, just waiting. I think it's a couple books deep in the pile at this point.
I was going to start one of the Dark Elf trilogy, but subathon season started, so we are live all the time.
The Dark Elf trilogy.
Yeah, it's based in the Dungeons and Dragons lore set, so it's about drow. Those are the Dark Elves.
Ah. Early 90s. Huh. Did it come recommended?
Yes. Press 2 in the chat if you've read it. I bet there are some who have. Bet. Yeah, in terms of nonfiction, Yeah, it's just American nations that I'm working through next. Anime, I've just been watching Kaiju number 8.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Really cool seeing a main protagonist in their 30s. I feel seen.
Pretty rare.
Yeah.
Pretty rare. Yeah, I've heard good things about Kaiju number 8. I think I read the entire plot summary on Wikipedia at one point.
Oh, yeah.
So it's probably been spoiled for me. But I also don't remember the details.
It's not super complex, but it definitely is a fun watch.
Kaiju number 8.
Did you ever see Parasite the Maxim?
Oh, is that the was that the movie for the Parasite anime?
No, I think it's just the anime.
Oh, that was just the name. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did see the anime. I didn't know it was called The Maxim.
Yeah.
Huh.
I use that just to distinguish between I think there was live action something called Parasite.
Oh, the movie. Yeah, the Korean movie that won the Oscar.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I remember it being a good show. I think you and Michael, I think, recommended that to me.
Yeah. The reason I say is because Kaiju number 8 has a similar sort of character in it. Who's the main protagonist. Also BG3, you get a parasite thingy. Gives you powers, changes you in some ways. I think those situations it's better to view a show of it happening to someone than to be afflicted by another entity that's influencing your will.
I haven't been doing any anime lately. Been mostly dicking around in C++.
What you been working on in that?
Mostly just trying to, one, remember how to do C++, and then also seeing how useful AI is in helping with that. It seems to be relatively on point thus far. But I'm also not doing anything especially sophisticated. I did get the random map generator nominally working, so that was progress. But I'm also probably doing it in like the least efficient, stupid way possible. I need to stop buying books. I should have a read a book and then you can buy a new one rule.
You're not allowed to buy a book until you read a book. Yeah, it's hard to read 2 books at once. Chat's saying AI is amazing to make programmers think they're being more productive while they're actually being less productive.
Is that right? Yeah, I'm not especially familiar with the field these days, but I can believe it.
Yeah, we have, I think, 3 people who had read Dark Elf Trilogy in chat. Nice. Yeah, Drow are one of my favorite factions in D&D.
1, 2, 3, 4, 6 books. I've just got 6 random books on the table next to me. There's even more scattered about. These are the closest in proximity.
Mm-hmm. Sun Tzu Art of War is on my desk right now. That one, there's a channel point redeemed to get me to read something from it. It's pretty interesting to me for books like this that they have a bunch of direct pieces of gaming wisdom, because a lot of the games that we play are simulations of elements of war or combat in some manner, so all the same principles apply. But if you're just jumping into the game, you don't necessarily respect those advantages and disadvantages of the ground, even if they've been written about for thousands of years. High ground versus low ground, all units arriving at the fight at the same time. Describing it as like people coming to a city market. For anyone who's been to a actual market, there's a huge rush in the morning whenever things first open, because they're trying to get whatever supplies they need before the workday, and then just to use for the rest of the day. And stuff opens at a certain time, so they all basically plan to arrive at the same moment, which is very good as well in setting up an engagement in military. If you're wanting to represent all your forces at once, then you want to make sure they all connect at the same moment, so they're representing their threat together, as opposed to staggered, where the enemy could deal with a part of your force first and then deal with the rest of it. I've definitely lost plenty of StarCraft matches by not executing that principle well enough, where your opponent will go to attack you and then you'll fight them with like 70% of your forces because they were already there, but then you had another 30% that were scattered somewhere else. You should just wait with the 70% and kind of back up and wait for them both to arrive at the same moment.
Yeah, the stuff I remember most from The Art of War was, I don't remember the exact quote, but something to the effect of, if you know yourself, you will win 1,000 battles. If you don't, then you will never win one.
Yeah, the joke interpretation I have of that one, which is partly true, is if you know the enemy and you know yourself, in 1,000 battles you will never be in peril. If you know the enemy but you do not know yourself, your chances of winning and losing are equal. And if you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you are certain in every battle to be fucked.
I applaud your memory.
Yeah. That's
Yeah,
a
a
pretty
very
common one.
strong.
A strong what?
I was just going to say there's a very strong psychological element to war beyond the positioning of units and whatnot. Yeah, you have to be able to know the proclivities not only of the opponent but your own biases.
Yeah.
Once you kind of get a reading on that, then you can plan ahead in a way that's difficult for the opponent to counter.
Yeah, and all of those can be really difficult to assess fairly whenever you have like ego and bias toward oneself, where you don't want to think about your own vulnerabilities, but your opponent is going to try to exploit your vulnerabilities, so it's better for you to just know what those are and prepare for them. Like Dota has a lot of that interplay where the heroes that you pick are strong at certain points and weak at certain points. And a lot of times the team that wins is the team that creates fights during their periods of strength, and they avoid fights in their period of weakness. But a lot of people are so egotistical that they're like, well, we should be able to just bring the fight to them whenever we want, when really you're making your job more difficult if you're attacking into their power spikes as opposed to attacking with your own.
Mm-hmm.
Well, cool. This has been a nice session. We learned about some heckin' East Timor, which I'd known almost nothing about. Protestant Reformation, South Africa. We got to veer around a little bit because it was a fairly quiet week.
Yeah, just a little bit of miscellaneous knowledge.
Cool. Well, thank you, Agent Smith, for your time. Thank you, chat, for your participation. Fuzzy Core for handling questions. And we will see you all in the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.